I am a longtime open source person. Some of you I know and have known a very long time. Some of you I hope to get to know. And it occurred to me, I don't think I put contact info on my slides, but I'm easy enough to find with Sarah Novotny on the internet. Like, you can find me somewhere. But I'll give a tiny bit of the story as to how I am here at Trinity. I am not representing Trinity. Thank you, John, wherever you are. I am not representing Trinity. I am not part of the Trinity OSPO. I am a lowly student here practicing my research skills. So I came to Ireland after a career in tech in the US for reasons which may or may not be obvious to those of you who are watching the US. But after moving here and choosing to move here, I've started looking at open source, of course, much more broadly. And so in this intersection conversation, there's a third intersection to open source and AI that I want to pull in here and as we talk, which is policy. So as we look at all of this, these different giant forces in the world of open source and AI, as they intersect, they distort each other. So that's sort of the metaphor that I'm going to pull through this talk and this thread, or as the thread through this talk. Policy does the same thing. And as we are getting to a space in the industry, at least, where open source is clearly valued, Claire gave us some great statistics, it is still not invested in the same way that warrants the output that we give. So, or in the impact we give even. So these distortions are things that we have to look at to try to understand how, as new concepts come into the world that we're working in, how we can use these distortions, use AI as a forcing function to make change in the way open source and the way policy intersect as well. So distortions, again, we're going to put on some crazy lenses here and take a peek at a few things. You've probably all seen, and please raise your hand if you haven't seen, the XKCD article about a tiny, okay, most of you have seen this. So we're building on work of prior generations of people all the time. And those building blocks are in fact what allow us to move forward and move quickly, both in industry, in research. It's why no one writes a math library anymore, or very few people write a math library anymore. So these building blocks that we pull together have led to a crisis because, of course, open source software is a living being, a living creature. It is not static. You don't write it once and it stays perfect forever. So we use the metaphor a lot, free like a puppy, because you have to maintain it. You have to take it home. You have to care for it. You have to make sure that your organization is engaging with it in a meaningful way. And you as academic OSPOs have even more of a hurdle at this point than we do in industry, or we have historically had in industry, because you're bringing people to software development and open source in some cases, or they do software development, but they don't necessarily understand the cultural background, anchoring, et cetera, of open source and how it works. It just is something you download off the internet. And that certainly was the case as to how I worked with open source until the early 2000s when I first got engaged with the MySQL community. And then as a service organization in one of the first companies that I founded, as a service organization, we were dependent on MySQL. And I didn't know initially how to write a bug report back, or how to participate, how to ask questions, how to go out and advocate about this software. And all of that is some of the work that your OSPOs get to do with the research community who haven't necessarily been, grown up and been steeped in the open source use and return back. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying industry has this right. I think that across the industry and across the world and open source more broadly, we have not managed how to do maintenance well. and how to do maintenance in a repeatable manner that is supported, that doesn't overwhelm our open source maintainers with, hey, I need you to fix this. Instead, hey, pull requests welcome. Feel free to offer me a complete bug report and maybe a patch. So this challenge has been exacerbated with AI in some interesting ways. One of which is that reproducibility can potentially go to zero. So people say, oh, this maintenance of open source thing is really, really hard to do. So I'll just write that new math library, I'll put it into Claude Code, and out comes a new library. So what we have to look as an industry, what is happening to our maintenance problem, which is an existing problem, and how that is impacted by AI. One of them is the potential that we will fragment to, a billion pieces, and we will never be able to maintain anything, and we will not be building off of each other's tools. But another possibility is that people, and we're seeing this already in open source communities, people are like, there's a bug, I threw it into Claude Code, here's a patch, but it doesn't know anything about the open source project. It doesn't know anything about the way that that project runs, what kind of coding compliance they have, what kind of coding best practices they have. They don't, the semantic choices that that project makes. So we're seeing, again, that distortion of how open source works and how open source can help us work within the addition of AI here. So we have, of course, the stochastic parrots spitting things out, which may or may not be good. To be fair, the most recent iterations of some of these tools are really good at some portions of software development, of some portions of software project architecture and planning and all of this. But ultimately, we continue as the person who is driving this tool to have to be able to take responsibility for the tooling that we're using, as well as the contributions that we make. So we're at this weird inflection point where I think some of the world thinks that we are solving everything because the robots are going to fix it. And I think most people who play in open source at this point, at least, recognize that the robots are actually making it messier from a couple of different from a couple of different distortion points. Pardon me, I'm gonna have a sip of tea. And these tools continue to grow and these tools continue to improve. But again, if we push this reproduction cost to zero and people do not see the value of these shared tooling blocks, or these shared software component blocks, then we have a real risk. I mentioned policy as another sort of policy/politics as another distortion factor here. And the challenge here with policy and politics is that we are in a multipolar world that is getting more fragmented and is getting scarier. And we're starting to talk a lot more about this nebulous thing, technical sovereignty, digital sovereignty, which can be used to mean any number of things. In fact, this is actually what I'm doing research on here at Trinity. So I'm trying to actually define what we mean by this and what we would actually want to contribute to this, as opposed to just saying as a buzzword. But as we see policy and politics change the way and distort the way software is developed, there are levers that are being pulled that make it appear that it would be better if your software was, created by someone who holds a particular color passport while standing in a particular plot of land, and that will fix your problem. But that doesn't fix the broader problem of good, sustainable software. It, again, fragments it. Even with AI, and in addition to help you as a fantastic tool, you are ending up with stacks and stacks and stacks of software it's a much easier to represent this as paper files than it is as files on a computer. But you end up with stacks and stacks of nearly identical, potentially mimeographed and then so lower fidelity at some level, pieces of software that do the same thing. And this is exactly what open source has been used to combat. We have used open source for the last 30 plus years to make sure that we have many eyes on a piece of code, that many people are using it across many use cases, so that we're touching at the edges of these dependencies that we have in order to build together. And that together has to be with long-term, durable, pseudonymous identity, where you build a relationship and an identity in that community so that you are trusted. I do a whole nother shtick on trust in software. And this is something that we need to preserve, and we need to be working with our legislators and the industry and our next generation of developers to understand the value of collaborating and building together. As I said, this maintenance thing is not fixed. And with these different levers of policy saying, maybe we need this to be sovereign, if we don't look at this carefully and if we don't work on this in a way globally, then we end up in an even more messy maintenance space. So back to the globe. I grew up in the US, but I've always kind of considered myself a citizen of the globe. And it wasn't until I moved out of the US that I realized that we had that privilege from a position of the hegemonic leaders. And as the last several years have been evolving, shall we say, it has been fascinating to watch the presumption and the arrogance of the US industry and the responses from the globe saying we need to make sure that we are able to manage and maintain and engage with and evaluate risk in our software systems. And that very much is, in my thinking, the definition of technical sovereignty. Starting from, you have to be able to identify your risk and then know how to make yourself resilient against it. Now, with all of this, we see the globe, we see the broader world, and we see academia being a great anchor point for this to figure out how to use the tools we have, one of which is this amazing open source community, which does generally think of itself as a global community, and use that community in order to help build the correct policy, the correct tools, including AI, in order to go ahead and make a sustainable open source ecosystem, a sustainable set of building blocks that we can globally innovate on top of. So where you are also as academia adjacent to policy and politics, because that seems to be another spot that intersects tightly with the academia, where you see people working on policy, where you have people that are interested in software from other portions of your university, pull them in to talk about the policy parts, pull them in to talk about AI and ethics, and help us figure out how we can build incentives around the software and these robots that we're building in order to make sure that as we are building and as we are using software, because much of this open source software is adjacent to AI, and I'll get to licenses and open source AI in a moment, or open weights AI. We need to make sure that we are building the right incentives into the system so that it's an easy paved path to do the right thing, as opposed to finding the second order and third order effects of policy that make it easier for a big company to do a thing and control it entirely. So to the point of open source AI, or open weights AI, which is a better way to describe it, this happened in part because we all want open source think of the four and the four opens. So the freedom to reproduce, the freedom to distribute, the freedom to examine, the freedom to modify, and then the four opens being the open collaboration, open community, open, I'm going to get these wrong, open development and open planning, I think. But all of that being in the open, this open source model is backed by something which is lowercase open, lowercase source. And that is the definition set that we have built over the years. But as open source has won and added so much value to the economy in the last 30 years and has grown to encompass 77% of all lines of code and 94% of all pieces of software contain some open source. As it's moved into this ubiquity, that lowercase definition has gotten attention, which is great. We love it. Everybody, this is why we have open source programs offices everywhere. This is why we have compliance regimes. This is why we need to play with this and why we have these license definitions. But it also, in getting all of this attention, has gotten the attention of policymakers. And in that case, it has privileged position in law. But again, it's still a lowercase o and a lowercase s. Just because we conventionally expect that we mean the licenses that the open source initiative have designated as open source does not mean that everyone in marketing and everyone in big companies are willing to abide by these non-legal definitions, because this is a community agreement. That's all it is we agree that these are what we mean by open source. These are the real licenses. But as policy is being developed, we see it not having a legal definition. And that is how we ended up at open source AI being a thing run with companies running ahead of definitions, running ahead of policy, running ahead of what we might all agree, and how when Meta dropped their first versions of Llama and said this is open source, even though it's got a EULA, which means that it's not freely accessible. And we didn't include any of the ways to examine what we did. They still called it open source because, again, it doesn't have a legal definition and there is no policy risk. There is no corporate risk to calling it open source. There is only upside. And so those challenges are part of why I think policy is super important in this. Now, I don't necessarily mean that we should figure out how to write in 200 plus countries what open source legally means. But I do think that as we figure this out and as we evolve what we're doing, because we are, running with scissors ahead of the crowd in open source, we have an incredible advantage. And that is the global community that builds this software that has 30 years plus of history in this and is able to sit and discuss what is important, why it's important, how putting a passport on top of your identity when you contribute to open source doesn't make it any more secure. As we see these different questions come up, working with the organizations, whether it's volunteer or getting your institution to participate in things like the European Open Source Strategy call for comments, which just closed this week. If you can get your institutions to engage with this, as we see this distortion of AI impacting open source and policy distorting each other, we need to be activating this global community. We need to be making sure that we are participating and using the institutions that we have as long levers, the same way corporations do with lobbyists. So we might only go 15 minutes. We may be a little bit short. I'm sure you'll all hate more networking time, right? Hate it. Yeah, okay, good. All right, well, I'm sorry I'm making you suffer through more networking time. So these distortions are just potentially, I should say, new ways to look at the world. Like, our brains eventually would invert this picture for us. If all we saw was this lens, we would adapt to it. And so these distortions, if we're not careful about how we engage with all of our tools and with all of our power today, if we're not careful about it, this becomes normalized. And this has become normalized with large-scale tech companies, for example, running ahead of legislation and just writing into their business plan that there will probably be some consequences in the terms of fines because these rules haven't been written yet. So we'll just put a line item here for that in my budgeting purposes. So we need to make sure that we are vocal and active and engaging in the things that we think are important about protecting open source, about looking at the intersections of open source and AI, because AI, of course, has a whole pile of things that could be open source. The entire training infrastructure could be open source. All the software that you use to build this could be open sourced. You could put this, there are all of these different pieces. And to be fair, there is an open source definition now from the Open Source Initiative, which does not include data for good reasons, even though I disagree with them. So there's lots of conversation about what it means in this case. There's another intersection with open source that I hadn't thrown into the slides, but just popped into my head, which is most of the training data going into these AI models are coming off of our open source code bases. So as we are building these tools, we need to understand what we find acceptable, or as we see the industry building these tools, and then we need to be advocating around it and making sure that we are not moving the industry or moving our open source communities in a way that will further distort things and then normalize them over time. So I'm still a big fan of brains, like the organic ones. And I think that the community and our thinking about things with the acceleration of tools, we can use tools, that's fine, but the tools we shouldn't be abdicating our responsibility to tools. And in a lot of cases, I think this is one of the challenges around technical sovereignty, is some of our varying governments have abdicated responsibility about software to third parties. But I think that we need to be making sure that we are independently and individually more responsible about the tools we're building, the pressure that we're putting in and on our legislators to make tools correct, and then holding our companies accountable, because the only metric that seems to be holding large-scale tech accountable these days is next quarter's growth. And next quarter's growth for the shareholder, when we look at quarter-on-quarter growth over and over and over, the only other thing in nature that seems to grow that way is cancer. Like the only thing that grows monotonically and does not ever contract is cancer. And so without intervention. So we have to be sure that what we're building and what we're holding our communities and our legislators accountable for with our wetware is in fact making the world a better place. So that's it for my slides.
Thank you, Sarah. And so now, thank you. And so now, well, before my brain blips gets corrected and we bring Josh up, I just want to open it to the floor for questions, so we can all get your wetware working. So Marvin, would you like to? And please, if you can introduce who you are and your institution, just so the folks know who you're.
No problem, and wonderful talk. My name is Marvin Barksdale. I'm a Director of Digital Development at Mass General Brigham, and I run our OSPO. I was really interested in the little aside you threw out about the lack of data inclusion in the open source AI definition. It's a critical issue for us because you mentioned cancer. We develop cancer algorithms that are trained off our patient data. So we have really sensitive privacy issues in terms of the, sharing that data. But it's been proven that the best algorithms are trained off that, giving access to that raw data. But I don't necessarily want to give everyone access to that raw data. I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, this is exactly a set of good reasons why it's not included in open source models. Because if you train on customer or patient data that needs all of those vectors, which we have proven over and over again can denormalize or can be reconstructed to point to a single individual super easily, that is not data that should be public. But we would love for the model to be public. So there's some really interesting tension there, and I would argue that this is where open source being policy privileged is a challenge, because people want things to be open source, whereas there could be another name for that, which is open medical licensed, or so whatever it comes up. I'm not in branding, let's be clear. But there, we don't have to stuff everything into the open source definition. And that, I think, was one of the challenges when the OSI was forced to respond to the corporate claiming of open source AI. And my throwaway comment of I don't necessarily agree with not having data open is only about, again, what I would think of as the capital O, capital S open source, as opposed to a broader way to share things openly. Yeah. So no, we need to have privacy. We need to have ways to build things that don't share all the data, but then share the output of it. So, but I wouldn't call that open source, but that's also the way I would think of it.
Thank you, Sarah. Anyone else have a question for Sarah?
Random comments?
Random comments?
Yes, I'll go this way here.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I had two notes and one question. Firstly, with the open source initiative definition of open source AI, apparently it's been reopened for a second round. And when it comes to definitions of open source, so my name is Jen Tritchell, I'm from the University of Cambridge. Definitions of open source software, even within the EU internal regulations, don't necessarily accord. So I've been doing this mapping exercise of the different regulations. And so if one government is taking divergent approaches, what does this mean for open source? And that brings me to my question, which is, do you think that policymakers should be tying their legislative definitions of open source to a community-generated definition?
That's hard. But it's lovely to meet you, Jennifer. Your name came up at FOSDEM and I was told I had to meet you, so yay. That's a really hard one. I think it is a reasonable answer because we have this as a global definitional standard for open source as a community, as a industry, or a subset of the tech industry. It also would lead to the ability for the community, through the existing community processes and governance, to adapt it as we need to. So I think that is reasonable from my industry and open source and community perspective. I don't know that legislators would be comfortable saying, we've now said that this is capital O, capital S, this is what we mean. And by the way, they're defining it. So I think that it would be the best outcome in the immediate term for what we have and the situation that we're in, since we have no legal definition of it. But I also think that that puts an enormous burden on the OSI, who is funded through corporate investments. It's a 501c3 that has corporate, thank you for the nods. It's 501c3 that has corporate funding as its primary mechanism. So that leaves it influenceable in a way that is uncomfortable to me. Not that government and policymakers aren't influenceable, as we continue to prove, but I think that it would be at some level an unfair burden to put on the OSI to do that. So I don't have a good, clean answer on that one, but it is. But I have thought about it, and it's a messy spot. Does anybody else have opinions? Yeah, no. Yep, there's Denise. Denise is like, don't do it, man. Okay, yeah. Unfair burden. Bad idea. Just straight up. Yeah.
Sorry. We've got one here from Sebastian.
Hi, it's Sebastian from Uphell. We are the European Open Source Business Association. However, in a previous life, I worked in the European Parliament, among other things, on the AI Act. And my question was exactly what Jen also already said. And just because you were also asking for comments, it's not a question.
Please.
Pretty much the thought process that went into the definitions in the AI Act, Product Liability Directive, and the CRA was to not define it too much legally and to keep using and trusting the community process as well.
Yeah, that is clear. I worry where that falls down is the lack of teeth to follow it through when a corporation decides that they will just use it because it gives them that policy privilege. So I like the way it worked out as a middle ground, and I certainly understand that, but I think there needs to be, and if you don't have a firmer definition, you can't have, a firmer consequence. So it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And thank you. Yes, I am happy to have comments. This is great fun. Oh, Denise.
So the truth is, open source maintained its brand integrity with negative publicity consequences if somebody was a bad actor in that world. And that worked really well until, I would say, roughly 2016, when shame went away. And so now it's going to unfortunately be up to all of us to say, oh, hell no. And to find people with sufficient weight and gravitas that they can help us say, oh, hell no. And that fight is inevitable. So, if you want to play in open source, you got to get used to putting on your gloves.
Excellent point.
Okay, thank you for we got one from Henry.
Got one more?
I think there's a mic over there beside you, Henry. If you can introduce yourself as well, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Henry Poole, and I'm curious if you know, or if you can share anything about the FSF definition that they're working on for the AI, machine learning.
Actually, I cannot. I would have to go look at that one up. I have not spent any time with that one at this point. Does anyone else have FSF definition, AI, machine learning?
They presented the work in progress at FOSDEM.
Okay.
It's based on the 4 freedoms, and it's also narrowed from AI to machine learning.
Yep. Cool. I will have to go watch that because FOSDEM talk for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I don't have sorry.
We have follow-ups. So, and I'm sure there will be plenty of follow-ups in terms of discussions at the break, but I want to say thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Big round of applause again.